Welcome to the Deep Dive from irisharchaeology.org. If you're keen to get a thorough understanding of Ireland's deep past quickly, then you're in the right place.
Today we're exploring something really quite challenging.
We are. We're looking at the Palaeolithic, the Old Stone Age, in Ireland. That time, before the ice finally retreated and the landscapes we're more familiar with started to form.
And it's challenging because, well, the evidence is so elusive, isn't it? Ireland's geology, the glaciers, the sea level changes, its island status, all these factors make finding and interpreting traces from that far back incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. So our focus today is on those fleeting footprints, as we're calling them, the hints of human presence before permanent settlement really took hold in the Mesolithic.
We want to understand what these very early interactions with the Irish landmass looked like. What can they tell us about the first people here?
It's fundamental, really.
Yeah.
It pushes back our understanding of when people first arrived and how they adapted or perhaps tried to adapt to what was a very different Ireland.
A really demanding environment.
Definitely. So in this deep dive, we'll look at the late Pleistocene environment, what Ireland was actually like then. We'll examine the key finds, especially from Alice and Gwendolen Cave and Castle Book Cave.
Crucial sites.
And we'll consider the challenges people faced and place it all in the wider context of Northwest Europe at the time.
Okay.
So let's start with that environment. A frozen canvas, really. What was Ireland like back then?
Well, the biggest factor was the last major glaciation, the Midlandian. Around 20,000 years ago, huge ice sheets covered most of the island. Think of it like a giant erasure, scraping the land, removing older surfaces.
So wiping the slate clean, potentially removing any earlier evidence.
Exactly. And as that ice started to melt, say around 11,700 years ago, what emerged first was basically Arctic tundra. Cold, treeless.
Bleak.
Very bleak. But, and this is key, the climate wasn't static. The late Pleistocene saw some dramatic swings.
Okay, tell us about those swings. They're important for understanding when people might have been here, right?
Absolutely. First, you get a significant warming phase, the Billing-Ellerud interstadial. That kicked off around 14,700 years ago, lasting for nearly 2,000 years.
So conditions improving. Greener?
Yes, potentially. We'd expect birch and willow woodlands starting to spread, grasslands too, elsewhere in Europe and in Britain, which was still linked to the continent then.
Like Doggerland.
You see clear evidence of hunter-gatherers, the Magdalenian culture, moving into these new landscapes.
But not in Ireland.
Well, that's the puzzle. Despite the warming, we don't have confirmed evidence of people in Ireland during this specific Billing-Ellerud period. The evidence we do have seems to cluster later.
Why the lag, do you think?
It likely comes down to Ireland being an island by then, probably by about 14,000 years ago.
Okay.
So you needed a sea crossing, and maybe the resources here were different, perhaps less appealing initially compared to Britain with its land bridge and different large mammals.
That makes sense. And then the climate changed again.
It did, quite dramatically. The Younger Dryas stadial. Around 12,900 years ago, temperatures plummeted again, returning to near glacial conditions for over 1,000 years.
A major setback.
A huge one. And paradoxically, it's during this very cold snap that we find some of the most compelling, though still debated, evidence for people in Ireland.
Like the finds we'll discuss later.
Exactly. Like the butchered bear bone from Alice and Gwendolen Cave, it dates right into the Younger Dryas.
So a dynamic picture. Ice, tundra, maybe some struggling woodlands, shifting climates, and importantly, an island setting. What about the animals living there? The megafauna.
Ah, yes. The Irish Quaternary Faunal Project has given us a great insight here. We know woolly mammoths were present, but their evidence seems to fade out around 20,000 years ago before the main period we're focusing on for human presence.
Okay, so probably not a primary target for later arrivals.
Likely not. But giant deer, Megaloceros giganteus, they definitely thrived during the warmer Billing-Ellerud. We find their remains at Ballybata and significantly potentially associated with human activity at Alice and Gwendolen. They survived until about 10,800 years ago.
A key potential resource then.
Absolutely. And reindeer, too. Rangifer tarandus. They were present at different times. There's that very intriguing, potentially cut-marked reindeer bone from Castle Book, dated way back to 33,000 years ago.
Definitely come back to that one.
But they were also around in the later glacial period, found at Castle Book, Keshcoran, Alice and Gwendolen, a really crucial prey animal in these cold environments.
And bears.
Brown bears, yes. Ursus arctos, they seem to have been a constant presence. And of course, there's that key piece of evidence. The butchered bear patella, the kneecap, from Alice and Gwendolen, dated to around 12,500 years ago.
So bears were both potential prey and maybe competitors.
Definitely competitors, possibly prey too. We also see evidence of spotted hyenas, but mainly before the peak of the last glaciation. Wolves appear in the late glacial, and Arctic fox remains tell us just how cold it could get.
Pretty formidable collection of animals. Anything notable missing compared to Britain or the continent?
Yes, and this is really important for understanding the challenges. During the late glacial, particularly that key window after the Bowling-Allerud warming, red deer and, crucially, horse seem to be absent from the Irish fossil record.
No horses. That's significant.
Hugely significant. Horses were a staple prey for Paleolithic hunters across much of Europe and Britain. Their absence in Ireland meant any people here had to adapt. They couldn't rely on those familiar hunting strategies. They had to focus on reindeer, giant deer, maybe bear.
Right. A different ecological context demanding different approaches. Okay, so we have this picture of the environment. Now let's get to those fleeting footprints, the actual archaeological evidence. For a long time, the thinking was no Paleolithic in Ireland, right?
That was the standard view, yes. Most textbooks would have stated that human presence began with the Mesolithic, around 8,000 BC, but recent work has really shaken that up.
So the Irish Paleolithic, chronologically,
Yeah.
we're talking potentially very early, maybe 33,000 years ago, right up to the start of the Mesolithic.
It's the time frame we're grappling with now, yes, though the evidence for the earlier end is still under intense scrutiny.
Let's start with the site that really kicked off the recent debate. Alice and Gwendolyn Cave, County Clare. What's the story there?
It was excavated way back in 1902 by R.J. Usher. A lot of animal bones came out, but the key discovery was much more recent. In 2011, Dr. Ruth Carden was re-examining the bear bones from Usher's excavation, and she identified clear-cut marks on a bear patella, a kneecap.
Cut marks suggesting
Butchery, human activity. And the really crucial part was the dating. Radiocarbon dating placed that bone squarely in the Younger Dryas cold period, around 12,810 to 12,590 calibrated years before present, Cal BP.
Wow. Okay. Smack bang in that cold period we thought might have been uninhabitable. What did the marks look like? Could they be natural?
Well, detailed analysis, microscopic analysis, showed they were consistent with being made by a sharp flint tool on fresh bone. Not gnawing, not trampling. Their position suggests someone was trying to cut through the knee joint.
Why would they do that?
Possibly to get at tendons, maybe marrow, or just dismembering the carcass. The implication is that humans processed this bear, likely in or very near the cave, during the Younger Dryas.
A game changer, then.
It really was.
Right.
When it was published in 2016, it caused a huge stir. Dr. Marion Dowd, who led the analysis with Dr. Carden, described it as a major breakthrough. Suddenly, we had tangible, dated evidence pointing to humans in Ireland over 4,500 years earlier than previously thought.
But as you mentioned, there's been debate. What are the counter-arguments or questions raised?
Well, some scholars, like Gray Moran and Jesse Toone, have questioned the viability of sustained human settlement during the extreme cold of the Younger Dryas in Ireland. Was it just a fleeting visit, a one-off event?
And the lack of other evidence at the site.
That's the other main point. In the layers associated with that date, there were no stone tools found alongside the bone, no hearths, no other clear signs of human occupation, just the cut-marked bone itself.
So while the marks look anthropogenic, the context isn't as strong as you might like.
Exactly. It leaves room for interpretation. Could some other process have made those marks? It seems unlikely given the analysis, but without associated cultural material, the case isn't completely closed for everyone. Although subsequent work has confirmed other Ice Age animals were present at the same time, providing the right ecological context.
Okay, compelling but perhaps not entirely conclusive on its own. Let's move south to Castlepook Cave in County Cork. This site has an even longer history, hasn't it? And potentially even older evidence.
It does. Castlepook was known to antiquarians and saw various investigations over the years. It's packed with Ice Age fauna. The recent Castlepook Cave project, led by Dr. Richard Jennings and Dr. Ruth Carden again, is using modern techniques, ERT, GPR, careful excavation to reassess everything.
And the really early find.
That's a fragment of reindeer bone. It was redated using accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS dating, and returned a date of around 33,000 years ago.
33,000.
Yeah.
Well, it's Middle Paleolithic territory, almost pre-last glacial maximum.
It is. If that date is accurate and associated with human activity, it completely rewrites the timeline for the first arrival of humans in Ireland, by a huge margin.
Okay, what's the evidence for human involvement with that bone? Cut marks again.
There are markings on that reindeer bone fragment and potentially on others from the cave too that could be cut marks. But, and this is a big but, proving they are definitely human-made and not from natural processes like cave sediment shifting, animal trampling, or carnivore gnawing is really difficult for bones that old.
Especially without finding stone tools right next to them.
Precisely. The team is doing incredibly detailed work, microscopic analysis, comparing the marks to known examples of butchery and natural damage. They're also excavating carefully, hoping to find undisturbed layers, Paleolithic horizons where tools might be found alongside dated bones.
Have they found such layers?
Recent test excavations in areas they've called Hyena Land and Elephant Hall.
Great names.
Aren't they? They have found well-stratified Ice Age deposits, including things like a baby woolly mammoth tooth. So the potential is definitely there. But finding that smoking gun a definite tool in direct, undisturbed association with bone, dated to 33,000 BP, that hasn't happened yet.
So the 33,000-year date is hugely significant, potentially revolutionary, but the human link still needs nailing down.
That's a fair summary. Dating itself is complex, too. They're using multiple methods, AMS radiocarbon, optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, on sediments, uranium series dating to build a robust chronology, but older dates always come with more uncertainties.
Are there any other potential clues out there? What about stray finds?
The most famous one is the Mel Flint hand axe, found near Drogheda in 1968. Typologically, based on its shape and how it was made, it looks very old. Some suggested lower or middle Paleolithic, perhaps pre-70,000 BC.
Wow, so Neanderthals.
That would be the implication if it were genuine evidence of presence. However, the overwhelming consensus now is that it's an erratic. Meaning it was likely made somewhere else, maybe Britain or even further afield, picked up by an ice sheet during the glaciations, and then dropped in Louth when the ice melted. It wasn't made or used in Ireland at that time.
So, geologically interesting, but not archaeological evidence for early humans here.
Correct. There are other scattered finds of flint tools that look potentially ancient, but they lack secure context. Found on beaches, in fields.
Yeah.
You can't reliably date them or prove they weren't moved or deposited much later. Rigorous evidence needs context.
It really seems caves are the key then, due to preservation.
Yes. Preservation bias is huge. Caves protect bone and potentially other materials from the weathering and erosion that happens out in the open. Ireland's glacial history and acidic soils in many areas mean open-air Paleolithic sites would be exceptionally hard to find even if they existed.
So our picture might be skewed towards cave use.
It almost certainly is. People likely use the wider landscape, but the evidence just hasn't survived or hasn't been found yet. It's also possible that caves were specifically targeted for certain activities.
And the activities suggested by the current evidence seem quite specific.
They do. It points strongly towards resource exploitation, mainly animal processing. The Alice and Gwendolyn bear, the Castlepoke reindeer. It's about butchery. What we don't have yet are the associated living sites. The hearths, the shelters, the full toolkits that you might expect with more established settlement.
Which brings us back to that fleeting footprints idea.
Exactly. It fits the current evidence best. Perhaps small groups making short trips, focusing on hunting or scavenging specific animals, rather than setting up long-term camp.
Let's think about what life must have been like for these visitors, however brief their stay. The challenges must have been immense, starting with just getting here.
Absolutely. Ireland, being an island from at least 14,000 years ago, means a sea crossing was necessary. Even if the distances weren't huge then, maybe crossing from Scotland or Wales.
Still requires boats.
It requires some form of watercraft, planning, navigation skills. We don't have direct evidence for Paleolithic boats here. It's incredibly rare anywhere. But they must have had the capability.
And once they arrived,
Yeah.
You mentioned the different resources.
Yes, the lack of horses, the different mix of animals compared to Britain or the continent required adaptation. Hunting reindeer, giant deer, bear, maybe different techniques were needed.
And isolation.
A huge factor. If only small groups made it across, they would have been incredibly isolated. Limited gene pool, risk of dying out from disease, accidents, a bad hunting season. The sporadic nature of the evidence might even reflect multiple failed colonization attempts, groups arriving, maybe surviving for a generation or two, but ultimately not establishing a permanent foothold.
It really puts the fleeting nature into perspective. It wasn't just about mobility, perhaps, but about viability.
Quite possibly. The sheer challenge of surviving on this isolated edge of the Paleolithic world.
And then layering the climate on top of that, especially that younger, driest cold phase. How do you survive that?
You need incredible efficiency. Effective hunting skills are paramount. You need to know how to make the most of every kill. Tool maintenance becomes critical, especially if good quality flint is scarce, which it generally is in Ireland compared to other regions.
Clothing, shelter.
Essential. We have to infer from contemporary European cultures, but well-made clothing from animal hides would be non-negotiable for insulation. Shelter, too, whether using natural rock shelters, caves, or constructing temporary shelters from hides and perhaps wood, where available.
And mobility seems key again.
Yes, following the herds, moving to find resources. But that constant movement contributes to the sparse archaeological record we find. It's hard to leave substantial traces if you're always on the move.
So survival depended on skill, technology, knowledge of the environment.
And probably strong social bonds within these small groups. Resilience, adaptability, living life right on the edge.
So the evidence, as it stands, points away from settled villages and more towards ephemeral hunting camps, task-specific sites.
That seems the most likely interpretation for now. Short-term visits focused on exploiting resources found in or near these caves. Maybe, as we discussed, representing those failed colonizations attempts that just couldn't sustain themselves in the face of environmental or demographic challenges.
It stands in stark contrast to what comes later in the Mesolithic, doesn't it? Sites like Mount Sandal show a much more established, diverse adaptation.
A completely different picture, yes. More permanent settlement, broader resource use, a well-defined toolkit. The Paleolithic evidence currently lacks that depth.
How does this rather fragmented Irish Paleolithic picture fit into the wider European scene? Let's compare Ireland and Britain first.
The differences are stark. Britain had those land bridges to Europe for long periods.
Via Doggerland.
Right, which allowed easier movement of people and animals back and forth. So Britain has a much deeper, richer Paleolithic record. Lower, middle, upper Paleolithic evidence, including Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis.
None of which we have credibly found in Ireland.
No. Ireland's potential Paleolithic is much later, late upper Paleolithic only, as far as we know. It's sparse, lacks those long cultural sequences you see in Britain. Even the Younger Dryas seems to play out differently, maybe causing abandonment in parts of Britain, while in Ireland, that's when our key evidence dates to.
So Ireland was always more peripheral.
Yeah.
More isolated.
It seems so. Its island status from that early stage is probably the single biggest factor explaining why its Paleolithic story is so different, so much fainter than Britain's.
And compared to mainland Europe during the late Upper Paleolithic.
While mainland Europe, especially France and Spain, saw flourishing cultures like the Magdalenian, sophisticated tools, incredible art in cave.
Vasco, Altamira.
Exactly. Widespread population movements responding to climate change. The Irish evidence.
Yeah.
It's like a distant whisper of all that. It probably represents very marginal groups, maybe pushed to the fringes or undertaking specific risky expeditions. Their material culture, what little we might have glimpsed, doesn't easily fit the established European types. It emphasizes that insular, perhaps even unique character.
No cave art found here, for instance.
Nothing remotely comparable from the Paleolithic. It highlights that divergence.
Okay, so we have this intriguing but incomplete picture. What are the biggest unanswered questions that researchers are still grappling with?
The absolute key question is still, how much evidence are we missing? Is the scarcity real, reflecting genuinely minimal human presence? Or is it just that most traces have been destroyed or buried by geological processes or lost beneath the sea?
That submerged landscape issue is a big one, isn't it? Coastlines would have been very different.
Hugely different. Lower sea levels meant areas that are now seabed were once dry land, potentially prime settlement locations. Exploring those requires marine archaeology, which is expensive and challenging.
And dating.
Always crucial. We need more high-precision dates, ideally using multiple techniques on the same samples for both old finds and new discoveries. And, as we discussed, the big missing link is finding securely associated stone tools with these early animal bone dates. That would be definitive proof.
So where do we look for answers? What are the promising directions for future research?
Well, continued work at the known key sites, like Castlepook, is vital. The goal there is finding those intact layers, that in situ evidence.
Going back through old collections, too.
Absolutely. Systematically re-examining museum collections with modern analytical methods. The Alice and Gwendolyn Barebone shows just how much potential there is in finds that have been sitting in boxes for decades.
And new science.
Huge potential there. Ancient DNA trying to extract genetic material from human or animal remains could tell us about populations, relationships, maybe even diet. Isotopic analysis of bones and teeth can reveal diet and mobility patterns. Detailed analysis of cave sediments can reconstruct local environments with incredible precision.
What about finding new sites beyond caves?
That's the challenge. We need targeted surveys in areas where preservation might be better, perhaps specific geological formations, maybe areas less impacted by glaciers. Developing predictive models figuring out where early people might have been based on landscape features and resource availability could help focus those surveys.
It sounds like it really needs a collaborative approach.
Essential. Archaeologists, geologists, paleontologists, dating specialists, climate scientists, everyone needs to work together. And refining our theories about how small pioneer groups colonize and adapt to marginal island environments is also important.
And sharing the information.
Crucial. Prompt publication, open debate, sharing data. That's how the field moves forward, especially when the evidence is so rare and potentially transformative. The reanalysis breakthroughs show that meticulous science on existing material can be just as important as finding brand new sites, particularly given how few really promising sites we currently know.
So the story of Ireland's Paleolithic is far from over. It remains this enigma, defined by those fleeting footprints in a drastically different landscape.
Exactly. The evidence is sparse, often debated, shaped heavily by environmental change and the limits of what survives archaeologically. But those faint traces are incredibly important.
They give us glimpses into the very first human interactions with this island, don't they? And highlight the resilience, the adaptability, perhaps the sheer audacity of people exploring this edge of the world.
And research is ongoing. There's always the potential for that next discovery, a new site, a redated bone, a securely stratified tool that could dramatically change our understanding again.
It's a story still being written. As a final thought for you listening, just try to picture it. Try to imagine that world tens of thousands of years ago. The ice sheets, the giant deer, the sheer emptiness, perhaps, in Ireland, almost unrecognizable.
It really makes you think about time, deep time, and the incredible journey that led to the Ireland of today and our connection back to those very first fleeting human footprints.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.